everyone, welcome back to Culture and the Environment. In this unit we will talk about the effects of toxic pollution on communities. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how pollution has been written about in anthropology. So in 1966, an anthropologist called Mary Douglas who wrote a seminal book on pollution. This was an analysis of ethnographic cases from all over the world that connected communities' ideas about things that were out of place to ideas about social order. In fact, environmental historians had been writing for a long time about concerns with pollution's health effects, and with scientific understandings of pollution. However, anthropologists only came to this topic in the past 2 decades. Pollution, Mary Douglas argued, is not an individual phenomenon, but it is a societal one. It is symbolically determined and not simply biologically determined. And its symbols vary, and so do the things that people are supposed to do once they are polluted or in a polluted environment. However, Douglas' works didn't address industrial or chemical pollution per se. She was really just writing about symbolic and ritual aspects of pollution, ideas about purity and taboo, ideas about what things should be like. So it's really interesting that at the time, Mary Douglas did not connect her analysis to concerns with toxic contamination that were spreading through public discourse all over the planet. In the United States, since at least the 1940s, there had been growing public debates on the harmful effects of organic compounds used as pesticides, as fertilizers, and in medicinal drugs, as well as the toxic effects of industrial pollution. In the past half century or so, activists and ordinary residents in the United States have called attention to the unequal exposure of low-income communities, and particularly communities of color, to the environmental contaminants from toxic waste facilities, factories, oil refineries, industrial agriculture, and more. These mobilizations have been spearheaded by Latinos, by African Americans, Asians, Black, and Native communities in particular. People who confronted toxic exposure in their own neighborhoods, in their own workplaces, and school. A standard definition of environmental injustice is the disproportionate exposure of certain communities compared to others to environmental risks, and also the lack of access to environmental benefits, for example, parks, recreation areas, community gardens, protected bike lanes, beaches, and so forth. Environmental justice organizing and research coalesced at the intersection of environmentalism and civil rights movements. However, until the 1990s, environmental advocates who had campaigned for wilderness protection, for clean water and air, for environmental conservation, remained largely uninvolved with environmental justice mobilization. And this has really started to change in the past 2 decades. The United States EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So in practice, the EPA writes, this entails striving for the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So more recent anthropological research on pollution, which takes this environmental justice concerns at its heart, has merged approaches from environmental justice and also from the field of the social studies of science. Anthropologists and other qualitative social scientists have accounted for how marginalized groups are exposed to more contaminants than others. They receive less or lower quality medical care, medical attention, and also for how communities struggle for political recognition, compensation and responsibility in the face of exposure. And so many have studied, both historically and ethnographically, the practices that produce and deny visibility to toxic threats. Anthropologists have written about regimes of bodily perceptions of toxicity. These, in turn, shape and are formed by both sensorial perceptions and scientific expertise. These regimes are also always politically and socially contested and culturally constituted. And so recognizing that the very legibility, the ability for people to assess environmental risk and toxicity and to have data about it and to be able to prove causal relations, this legibility is at stake in all of the environmental justice contestations. Anthropologists have studied as well the bureaucracies, the scientific debates, and community struggles about pollution and its environmental and health effects. So my question for you is toxic exposure a concern for you, for your family, and for your community? And what kind of data do you have available about your own neighborhood's air, water, and soil quality? What about toxic chemicals in your homes or in your water pipes? So for this unit, you have read 2 studies of environmental exposure to polluters written by 2 anthropologists. One is set in Puerto Rico and the other one in Louisiana's petrochemical industrial zones. So an anthropologist called Alexa Dietrich conducted research in a Puerto Rican town that she called Nocora, where a dozen factories were owned by 4 multinational corporations headquartered in the United States. And pharmaceutical companies are central not just to Nocora's economy, but to Puerto Rico's economy in general. And paradoxically, they're also some of the island's biggest polluters, impacting air, soil, and water quality. But the important economic and social role of pharmaceutical industries, their embeddedness into local economies and societies, has made it very difficult for local advocates to demand and receive accountability, as Dietrich finds over the course of her research. So many of the Nocora residents that Dietrich talked with and spent time with over the course of her research had come to normalize pollution. And at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies had positioned themselves as local partners and not just stakeholders, community advocates, and providers of much needed jobs and services. And so Dietrich was interested in finding out if the pharmaceutical companies' self-promotional language of corporate social responsibility, in fact, resonated at all with local residents. And she found that partially it did. After all, the pharmaceutical companies generated both jobs and pollution, contributed to local political rituals, and positioned themselves as actors holding expertise on public and environmental health. And partly she found the issue of why residents had taken this pollution for granted or had failed to mobilize for specific demands against these pharmaceutical polluters is because the issue was partially one of proving causality. It wasn't always clear to many residents exactly what kinds of health impacts stemmed from their own visibly polluted environments. So one of Dietrich's interlocutors, who was an epidemiologist, explained to Dietrich, he says, health problems, some you can quantify and some you cannot. As a researcher, you have to know that what you're dealing with is just a portion of a larger health problem. For example, the epidemiologist continued, the perception of the problem and its impacts in a community are not always quantifiable, or at all. And in fact, proving a causal relationship between environmental risk and health problem is a very complex epidemiological task, way beyond something that residents have the capability for. And often residents exposed to toxic contamination have struggled to hold polluters accountable for their own health impacts. And even more, violations of environmental standards and regulations were partially considered to be necessary by many for the island's economic development. And Dietrich found that many local officials were quite ambivalent about enforcing federal standards for pollution control and remediation. So Dietrich was interested in syndemic relationships. Syndemic means there are mutually augmented occurrences of health problems. So as residents get exposed to pharmaceutical toxics over the course of their lives in the shadow of these factories, the exposure accumulates in their bodies and can become syndemic of many other long-term problems. And she also interrogates the processes through which people had come to naturalize or accept harmful environments, how they had come to be constituted through their relationships with these big corporate neighbors. In a different context, an ethnographer called Gwen Ottinger studied community responses to an oil refinery in a town called New Sarpy in Louisiana. Armed with the results from a citizen science campaign in which they had repeatedly tested air quality in the area using buckets and bucket sampling, community organizers filed a lawsuit and demanded the petrochemical industry in their area financial compensation enough for everyone to relocate to a different area. However, company representatives had always disagreed with that data. The refinery, they claimed, had no issue with air emissions, they stated, positioning themselves as stewards of community health and working with activist communities to convince them to see their corporation as a collaborator and as no longer an enemy. They worked to get the community to eventually drop the lawsuit and to instead accept a cash payment and grants to continue living in New Sarpy. So do you think this was a positive outcome or a failure? Do you think it benefited or it hurt New Sarpy's residents? And who do you think benefited or was hurt the most? So Ottinger is interested precisely in this shift. She argues that as the oil refinery positioned itself in the early 2000s as a community partner, it also regained scientific and moral authority over the health impacts of its emissions. And this was against the claims of long-standing citizen science activists who had argued that there was a direct causality between refinery pollution and widespread respiratory illnesses and high cancer rates in the area. And this was also against residents' demands for collective action and compensation. And so paradoxically, the residents of New Sarpy let the refinery continue to operate in their town and also became an ally, ending their prior demands for environmental justice and for recognition of the refinery's toxic emissions on the surrounding neighborhoods. And so according to Ottinger, we should understand this case in the context of a wider transformation, the withdrawal of governmental oversight over pollution control, shifted to instead adopting the role of mediating relationships between companies and communities themselves. In the recent 3 decades, industry players have increasingly become responsible for providing and ensuring environmental safety and for protecting citizens' health. In this neoliberal terrain, individual choices have become the grounds for moral debates, particularly about the responsibility of pollution, but also for individual choices. If residents moved to New Sarpy after their oil refineries had already been operating, some claimed it would have been their choice and also would have been their responsibility to assess the environmental risks and hazards of that decision. And many residents recall the rural landscapes of New Sarpy. There were other refineries, they said, but they were really further away. They had not chosen to live in the shadow of a petrochemical polluter. However, people's actual stories were a little more complex than this standard narrative Ottinger found. So for example, in conversation with an elderly African American couple, Ottinger heard one of them claim that when they moved to New Sarpy, there was no refinery, there was only an empty field and forests. However, her spouse immediately contradicted her. Well, there had been petrochemical plants in the region for half a century, and these were places where local residents worked. In fact, people had come there looking for jobs. It is true that before even the petrochemical industry became so dominant in the region had plantations and sugar processing facility. And New Sarpi, like other towns in the region, had developed alongside and connected to the refineries. So many residents, in fact, moved to New Sarpi after the new refinery had already been built, and they moved there for a number of different reasons, often a combination of inherited family land, having ties to relatives already living in the areas, needing their help, or having family obligations towards them, but also choices about good school districts and advantageous tax rates. These narratives potentially undermine the residents' demands. According to some industry engineers, residents had moved to New Sarpi already aware of its environmental health risks, and yet residents told Oettinger over and over again that they had not even considered the possibility at the time that chemical emissions from the plant might make them sick. And further, they had no scientific data made available to them from the refinery or from local governmental authorities prior to their moving there. And the perception began to change once they became residents, and after several years, they all began to experience first-hand higher cancer rates in their neighborhoods and widespread respiratory illnesses. This local knowledge that developed based on people's sensory experiences, their bodily observations, but also their conversations and their anecdotal evidence, changed New Sarpi residents' understandings of the environmental risks that they had been exposed to and its consequences. In fact, environmental justice researchers have shown over and over again that communities do not come to live in toxic neighborhoods because of the poor choices that they make as individuals or as families. Oettinger shows that New Sarpi residents' choices were always constrained. They were constrained by poverty, they were constrained by race, by political systems that allocate polluters to the more economically and socially vulnerable areas. In the absence of a lot of resources and safety nets, residents moved to and continued living where they had access to affordable land, to housing, and to a network of family members. They were subject to wider structures that produce and reproduce inequality, the legacies of racial segregation and racist mortgage lending, local governments controlled by elite residents and interests, and pro-business governmental policies. In addition, residents could not easily or at all obtain the high scientific standards of proof to demonstrate that industrial pollution was directly harmful to their health. So now I would like to end this unit with another question for you. What is the anthropologist's role in each of these two cases as they work with community members who are not a homogeneous group, of course? They have different perspectives and interests and stories, with industry representatives and with governmental officials. What do you think are the ethical concerns and demands and responsibilities that anthropologists face when they're doing research on contested environmental justice and environmental health issues? I look forward to discussing your answers and your thoughts soon, and I'll see you all very soon.